Dr. Sarah Stein Lubrano got her PhD from Oxford and master's degree from the University of Cambridge. She works with the Sense and Solidarity Initiative and the Future Narratives Lab. She's also served as the head of content at the School of Life. Her new book, Don't Talk About Politics, has me reeling. The implications of her no-nonsense approach to what works in political communication are pretty radical, I think. Lubrano is trying to outline a path to more flexible, accessible ways of communicating and organizing than the ones we currently have. She says that the act of building social relationships, not doing more prestigious things like making documentaries and writing books, is the single most important site of politics. If that's true, how do we make political appeals to people while reckoning with the widespread social isolation that they're feeling? Sarah says that discourse, quote, which is so highly valued in theory in our society, appears to be quite ineffective in practice. With many of the political conversations that people typically have, it often feels like there's a wedge in place before we can even begin to engage. Lubrano says it's because we're forced to choose between the model of discourse as a battle or the idea that it's a kind of marketplace of ideas. These two polar opposite metaphors are the only ones we seem to have for how conversation nourishes a democracy. At its core, her book is concerned with what it means for democracy to be reduced to either marketing or killing. The questions that Sarah is currently taking up in her work have obviously become more pressing with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the far-right social media influencer who was shot at a public event in Utah. This was a globally witnessed murder that sent shockwaves through state politics, the alt-right media sphere, and into the far reaches of the internet. Lubrano wrote for The Guardian that there are lots of reasons why debate, and indeed information giving and argumentation in general, tends to be ineffective at changing people's political beliefs. I connected with Sarah again after we recorded our initial conversation about her book. Because Kirk's murder represents a crossroads for a lot of people, it's a confounding moment that's causing people to reflect on the poisoning of public discourse. How did Kirk change people's minds? Was it through debate? Or did his organization, Turning Point, mainly use the spectacle of a debate as a kind of recruitment strategy? How and when do we change our minds? There's this beautiful moment in your book where you say, like, I am pretty sure, dear reader, that if you're reading this, it's because you're already like thinking about these things, right? The book is not the tipping point for you. It really started before this book.
I mean, this is basically about, I have a very specific idea of at least one of the readers of my book, right? I think there are going to be people who read it who are already pretty convinced that you cannot persuade people with words, that you need to do embodied activism. There are going to be people who are on the left in various ways who don't feel attached to liberalism. But I also wrote this book with a kind of person who, let's say, is grieving aspects of liberal life, right? And I actually think more of us are in this category than we might want to admit, because at least if you're an American, and certainly if you are in some other countries as well, there was a period of time in like liberal Western democracies where things seem not great, but also kind of like structurally somewhat sound. And this was an illusion, and I'm not saying that that was a good analysis, but I think it's very clear now that, like, the gloves are off and the train has gone over the rails, and whatever metaphor you would like to use. And so I've written this book for someone who already is seeing that. I think if you don't see that, if you think that life is basically fine and things are going to be okay, and like, everything is all right, then this book is not for you, and nothing I could possibly say would even be of interest to you, right?
Fair enough.
um and so, and to be fair, a lot of my readers, and now that I'm on all the social media, I experience my readers a lot. I also experience them in talks. They are there. They're kind of like, hey, I really thought I understood the world, and then climate change started happening near me, and Donald Trump was elected twice, and actually there are like racists in my neighborhood and a bunch of other things, and I'm losing my job, and what do I do? Because actually it turns out politics has come to me, even though I didn't go looking for it, or politics doesn't work the way I thought, and now I need to do something else.
Yeah. No, and let's, maybe press pause on like really digging into what the book says about like the post-liberal perspective on discourse that it has, right?
Mhm.
Like in the limitations of debate, and maybe talk a bit about like the kinds of relationships, parasocial perhaps, that you're developing with people
Yeah,
online,
okay.
I was interested to find in your book that you actually have worked with tech companies. I didn't know that about your
Look,
background,
being public
but like
intellectual doesn't pay, you know, you have to have a job. Right? So I
it's
haven't
true.
worked with
Yeah,
like
it's
the big
true.
evil guys or anything. I don't work for them. At least certainly not. I once worked for organizations that worked for them, but I've never worked for them. I'm not like
Ah,
secretly an ex-employee. I mean that I've worked for like well-being startups that are tech apps, right? So I
sure.
know how like it works to UX design an app. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I mean, I think in a way that's kind of why I wanted to write this book. I mean, if we were to broadly and annoyingly characterize two fields of literature, I wanted to do a weird mashup between them. So one field of literature is like general left wing book world, which I imagine you're familiar with, very perhaps,
Hmm.
right? And I love general left wing book world, and I share many of the ideological commitments in a very strong way with left wing book world. And left wing book world is concerned with, you know, like should things be horizontal? Was Marx right about capital? Probably yes, except for this one way. You know, like that's kind of the world of left wing book world. There's like a world of eco books
Hmm.
there. All that's great. Things left wing book world is not particularly good at. Talking to anyone outside of left wing book world, uh, um, you know, using honestly, for the most part, using modern science. Not super interested in that. Deep skepticism for some decent reasons, for some silly reasons of modern science. Using anything to do with psychology that isn't like Freud or Lacan. Not so good at that. Um, you know. And then
Hmm.
there's another field of
Hmm.
books, which is like, hey, I am Steven Pinker slash Jonathan Haidt slash endless stream of mostly white psychology men. And that field is, and a bunch of people who are actually even less qualified to be chatting about anything. Like they're just journalists, Mr.
Hmm.
Gladwell, and they are incredibly popular. Oh my gosh, they sell so many books! Wow, they
Super
sell an
popular.
endless
Yeah.
amount of books. It's nuts.
Yeah.
They are keeping publishing houses afloat, truly. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't just want to eat into their sales, although that's a fun game to play. It's more that I think, you know, it's a missed opportunity. And also, unlike some left wing people, I believe it is possible to critically read and process science, let's say, right? I don't think science is like the objective one truth about the universe, but I also think it has lots of interesting things to say, even though it is produced in a very specific, often frustrating, sometimes unethical, and always slanted way. It is still like a useful aspect of the human experience that tells us things about our lives.
Hmm.
And sometimes the people I like, for example, run workshops for are mad at me about this. They're like, what do you mean science is just this horrible like oppressive structure? And I get it, but I don't fully share this view. I do think there are uses of science that are legitimate on the left. So um I
Mm.
wanted to create like a mashup between these two worlds where I could say on the one hand, like, here's some really interesting stuff that we can discern about human psychology from these studies, even if we don't share all the commitments of the people that do this scientific project. Here's how it can help us explain this problem that we want to understand as people effectively on the left in a way, right? We want to understand why people are embracing the terms of their own oppression and why they disagree with each other without any recourse to further dialogue. And what does this mean? And I wanted to
Hmm.
speak to both audiences in a way, or at least to the people that are curious enough to walk between them.
Yeah. No, and like you basically say like there are just these models that are like clearly broken, right?
Mm,
And I like the perspective that the crises that we face, the amount of time that we have, it just basically dictates that we do have to try to grasp and use what we know works, what the data suggests works. And I kind of appreciate that kind of like pragmatism, but like to you kind of opened up this thread on like the method of the book that I want to maybe follow. Like in writing the book, you actually state that you're using an interdisciplinary and speculative approach for maybe both of these two big bodies of literature. And I really appreciated, honestly, like the sort of almost flippant way that you bring in some of these theorists from lefty book world, right? Like just like if you're talking about Habermas, you're pretty straight about where the blind spots
mhm.
are, all that kind of stuff. I found really accessible and like it resonated. Um, was it kind of at all difficult for you to maintain that approach, or have you kind of cultivated this thing that you call a quote way of structuring thinking so that it embraces more ambiguity, more
Yeah, that's
uncertainty?
a
I
great
mean, that's
question.
not easy to do,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I would say, look, I have a very particular um, I have a very weird background where I worked for a long time as a public facing communicator, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that has helped me a lot. I'm in a very specific way. I'm sure there are other people that should be dealing with Jürgen Habermas in a completely different way. But, when I worked for the School of Life and then afterward when I worked in other public facing ways and up to the present moment where now I just have my own audience of people, right? I spend a lot of
Mm-hmm.
time communicating to the public, like standing in front of a bunch of human beings who left school a very long time ago and aren't necessarily spending most of their free time reading books and talking to them. And so I write in a way that is extremely conscious of those people. And I also have the ethos of a learning designer, which is my professional training before I got my PhD, which means I
Mm.
designed learning experiences for a living for the average person, right? Not for like academics. And in that process, I really met a lot of people who are much more close to the average reader than maybe some, let's say to generalize, some academics meet, and I would talk to them about their feelings and their divorces and their worries and their frustrations, and as time went on, their anxieties about climate change and parenting and why do I feel so lonely and why can't I reach out to my friends and
Mm.
why has my life not turned out the way I thought it would. And I write with that in mind. I like write with that really profoundly in mind, and I also really listen to the people at my talks. I try really hard. I'm not saying no one else does, but I definitely do. I like
Mm.
think a lot about them, and I think about them because I think, you know, that's the place I start from. I always think about a Terry Eagleton quote. He has a quote in his book on ideology, which is something like, uh, "It is beneath the dignity of a rational creature not to understand the conditions of their own oppression." Right. And
Mm.
at the best, at minimum, as an ideology explainer, you're giving people the tools to understand, like, why is my life so hard? And
Yeah.
even if you can't fix that for them, and even if you're not sure if they're going to be able to fix it for themselves, I think you are granting them a piece of dignity by believing that they are smart enough to eventually understand what it is that's going on for them. And I write like that. And so,
That's gorgeous. Yeah, I think that's incredible. Sorry if you want to keep
no, no,
going.
no, I just
I
want to
just
say, I start
yeah.
from that. And I think sometimes this is not obvious to people because, like when I sent my book to someone like Sophie Lewis, who is
Mhm.
I would say also can sometimes do this, by the way. I'm not saying she doesn't, but I more mean she has a more split audience. I think some of her audience are more already like committed leftists or whatever, right? I had to kind
This
of,
is the author of Abolish the
yeah,
Family?
and Enemy Feminisms is the latest. So when people
Right, right,
write a
right.
bit more in left book world, which is also a valuable task, especially I would say Sophie's work
Right.
is a little bit more on the cutting edge of like how should we theorize this thing today, which is a different project. I'm often not
Mhm.
quite doing that. I'm usually doing a slightly different thing. But anyway, I have to warn her, hey, this book is, if you like it, that's awesome. And if you get an insight out of it, I'm so pleased. I'm honored. But like, I've written this for these people.
Mhm.
And so we start
Mhm.
with that. Yeah. And then I think the other thing I've learned over time is like a lot of people, and I think we should be really sympathetic to this as people that want to liberate people. Like a lot of people had bad experiences of school or they had a good experience of
100%.
school, but then they're never allowed to go back to it again because they have to be an accountant or whatever, right? So
Yeah.
either way, it's not always that helpful to make it seem like you want to be serious enough that you show you think that they're intelligent, but like
Mhm.
it actually is quite helpful for them to have people in the book be characters. And I mean that in a positive sense. Like I don't think I'm making fun of Jürgen Habermas. I just think it's actually helpful for my reader to think about him as a person. At the end of the
Yeah.
day, he's just some other guy that's like interested in the pursuit of knowledge and like,
I love that
yeah,
demystification,
like trying to solve
you
a
know?
problem. And actually, in my next book is going to have a lot of neuroscience in it. Um,
Mhm.
Probably to the distaste of many left wing people, but who knows? And so I interview all these neuroscientists and I try to figure out, like, hey, is this thing real? And if so, what does it mean? And, do you guys agree on it and all of that? But I also try to paint the neuroscientists as people. And I talk about how, like, they often talk to me on their commutes and what is their commute like? And, oh, they're like eating a burger and, whatever. Not because I think there's anything not serious about the work they're doing, but because I think that everyone's work is just like a human endeavor of labor trying to get to a thing. And I want my
Mhm.
readers to think about both what Habermas is doing and what the scientists are doing and what I'm doing, and then ultimately what they're doing as this process of like creating human knowledge together.
Yeah. Yeah, 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 and I mean, like, that I call it demystification, but it's really, it's like a little bit more radical almost than that. Like I think of Patricia Hill Collins and
Mhm.
the Black feminist epistemology and how like you need to be aware of people's sort of like biography,
Yeah.
their affect, like you talk about how Robert Putnam is this like deeply sentimental
Yeah,
guy, right?
yeah, he
And I
is.
kind of love that, you know?
Right, and I think it's
Um,
important
yeah.
because I want people to feel like there are different ways of solving this problem, but we do share this problem, you know? And it's not like I owe Robert Putnam a lot, and I also think he's really wrong about his theory of change because his theory of change is like I, Robert Putnam, will personally go chat to the president of the United States, you know, and like right now the president of the United States is Donald Trump, so like
That's
he's
right.
not going to chat to Robert Putnam. But also
Yeah, good luck.
importantly,
Yeah.
when Putnam did chat to two presidents of the United States, nothing happened. So of
Right.
of you know significance that it could be reflected in the graphs he cares about, let's say,
Mhm.
and that matters too, right? So I want yeah, yeah, it matters who you are, and look, it matters who I am also, right? And in my next book, which is
Yeah.
about social isolation, I have to walk a very careful line as the sort of like sociologist, ethnographer, political theorist, where I kind of have to say like I'm pretty sure my thesis is right, and I think roughly what I'm going to suggest is true, and it tells us some things we should do, but it's really worth knowing that I am like an incredibly extroverted, fairly privileged, like urban, lady.
Right.
And that there are just going to be things that I miss. And there are things that I kind of know about, but I'm
Right.
never going to fully understand. Like if you have long COVID, a lot of what I'm about to suggest is going to feel really fucking annoying. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this
Mhm.
podcast. It's going to be really annoying
Feel free.
uh,
Feel free.
because being chronically ill is horrible and annoying in a lot of cases, but
Yeah,
also
yeah.
most cases maybe. But also like these specific things are just both the cause of a lot of suffering and or impossible, and that's very hard, and I think a lot of social problems actually are much more like this than most political theory allows. So yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah. No, there's a funny moment in the book where you say like we need to come to terms with the fact that some of us are kind of like more popular than others
yeah,
and that there's power in that, like it's like a simple insight but an important one.
yeah,
And like we are here, two people creating content for the web,
yeah.
and it kind of gives us an occasion to think about maybe viral popularity. There was just this video of
Oh yeah,
you
you
that
saw
I
that. Okay.
went semi-viral. I mean, it popped up in my feed.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You're talking about the sadness of the left
Oh yeah,
in the video and some of the reasons for it and some of the ways to kind of resist it or address it.
yeah,
And like, this is a video that has garnered a staggering 24,000 likes
yeah.
since it
A
went
third of
up,
a million
which is kind
people
of nuts.
watched it, which is completely crazy. Like someone in India
It's
probably got and
amazing.
was like, "Hey, is this your daughter?" This
I mean,
this
like,
video.
and it's all opaque how the algorithm fuels that, but something happened there. You hit on something,
Yeah.
presumably.
Yeah, I actually think that reel is really interesting and also a bit funny. So it's funny, and this brings us
Mhm,
back to the book, so maybe it's useful. This is a
mhm,
reel that where I just talk about this one little bit of research in my writing. It's something I actually wrote an article about a long time ago, and then in the end it kind of necessarily crept into the last chapter of my book because one of the things that happens a lot in my writing is that I'm always asking people to do hard stuff. Like
mhm,
none of the solutions to what I think we need to do are easy. They all involve like, hey, we need to all become deeply embedded in our communities, and then we need to talk to a bunch of people that are really difficult, and then we need to change our whole lives, and then we need to change their lives. And honestly, when I give talks about this, people come up to me and they're like, "That's really hard.
mhm.
Can't we do an easier thing?" And then I have to say, "No, no, we can't. We have to
Yeah,
do
yeah,
this
yeah.
thing. This is the thing."
It's like you were looking for a TED talk,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah. Like and also, it's funny because I think technology in particular gives us this sense that there should be like a turnkey solution to all the things that is like frictionless
Yeah.
and seamless. And like, forget it. Welcome to politics. It's not like that. It will never
Mm,
be like that, and it could never be like that. And
yeah.
anyway, but so in the end, I put in this pep talk, which is a thing I truly and deeply care about and believe in, which is that activism makes you happier, right? That
Mhm,
the general social science world, there's a bunch of fairly good and fairly consistent data that, on average, people who consider themselves left wing also consider themselves less happy, and this is true even when you like balance for all this stuff. This is not fully in the reel, by the way, because reels can only be really, really short. But there's a
mhm,
lot of thought gone into this data. It's complicated because
mhm,
people are, to a degree, self-analyzing how happy they are, but there are other measurements that are used also. Anyway, you can balance. You can look at two people that are sociologically very similar. Maybe they're both black women who are married and go to church or whatever, right? And then you can say, okay,
mhm,
this one is right wing, this one is left wing. The left wing is sadder on average, right? And then you can do a
mhm,
similar comparison where you're balancing for all this other stuff and you're saying these people have the same political views. and the same sociological characteristics, but this one is involved in activism and in a social movement on the left, and this one is just has the
Yeah.
same left-wing beliefs. And the person who's an activist is happier. They rate
Right.
themselves as happier. They see themselves as having, I believe, more meaning in their lives. And there are probably some other measurements. Certainly, mental well-being is one of them. So people, report having fewer or less intense mental health
Right.
issues. And that's really interesting, but it's not that surprising in a way if you live in the world I live in, because it's a very common finding that people that are actively engaged in the world are happier, that people who feel like they can do something with their lives are happier, any sense of agency improves people's well-being, etc.
Yeah.
But, and this I swear was mostly by accident, I accidentally framed this in a way that created rage bait, right? There's no nicer word for
Mm.
it, because I framed it as like people on the left are sadder, people on the right are happier, activists are happier than non-activists. This is great. But what ended up
Mm.
happening, and this is classic for social media, is that every single person that saw the reel, okay, a small group of people liked it because they were like, I'm an activist and now I know I am well, yay, and I have some lovely comments from people
Mhm.
that are like, oh, this is so true, I joined this group and now I'm so much happier. And then lots of people who are just furious, either at me,
Mm.
a lot of like, this is nonsense, the usual nonsense from men that like, how would you even know this, like, I bet you don't even have a PhD, whatever. And
Right.
then,
They've done their own
of course, yeah,
research.
yeah, I love those
Yeah.
dudes. I mean, to be honest, I kind of do feel, now that I understand how the algorithm works a bit better, I kind of do like those dudes in that they are
Mm.
unintentionally like giving me, they're pushing me up the algorithm, because comments
For
are the number
sure.
one algorithm generators, right? So every time they tell
Yeah.
me like your PhD is fake or whatever nonsense, I'm like, okay, buddy, but like you just got me like 6 more followers, so like, I don't, whatever.
That's
I
right.
mean, I know that sounds bitchy, but what else can you say, right?
I know what you're saying.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I get
then
it.
and then everyone else is just mad. So the right wing are mad because I am too left wing. The left wing people are mad because I said something about Jeremy Corbyn that they perceive to
Yeah.
be
You
denigrating
don't have
him.
to like Jeremy
But I just said you
Corbyn.
don't have to like Jeremy Corbyn to fit in this
Yeah,
this umbrella of the left. I actually
I get
campaigned
what
for
you're
Jeremy
saying. Yeah.
Corbyn's MPs. So like I'm not actually against, I mean, I don't know whether that was a greatly conceived campaign, but like I'm not trying to trash Jeremy Corbyn. I'm trying to talk
Sure.
about the demographic I'm reaching, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
anyway, blah blah blah, they think I hate Jeremy Corbyn, someone thinks I'm a liberal, then the liberals think I'm like a crazy leftist who's going to destroy everything, and so anyway, everyone's mad, and so everyone's so mad that like I got 200 comments and I got a third of a million views. That's nuts. But to bring it back to
That's
my
crazy.
book, it really
Yeah.
reinforces a point, which is that right now our world is set up to weaponize debate, I would almost say, right? Not
Right.
even just to like reward it, although it, by accidentally generating a completely deranged debate, it did in fact reward me with 2,000 new followers, lol, and more growing. uh Hello, new followers. But no, but I think algorithms do this for a reason, which is that they know that people who are upset are also going to stay longer on that content and use the app for longer, right?
Yeah.
And so if they see comments developing in a pattern that looks like a debate, and I really am using the term debate generously here because it's mostly just people
Mm.
insulting each other forever. Uh,
Hmm.
they push your algorithm, they push your video up the feed, right? And then everyone has seen Sarah
Hmm.
Stein Lubrano's video, which is deranged. And also, like, I think it's a nice point that I'm making if you ever get to it, which most people don't. They just fight with each other in the comments. But um,
Mm.
it's kind of a really weird reason for that to be the video that takes off. And I really began to understand how a lot of people, like I now completely understand why Andrew Tate is like really famous, right? I mean, I
Sure.
intellectually knew this before, but it's just going through it, you really see it a different way. Or, oh, of course Andrew Tate is really famous because he hacked into like saying incredibly offensive stuff. And then of course people fight in the comments. And then of
Yeah.
course he like wins the algorithm all the time. I only get a viral video like this. I'll only get one every couple of months because the algorithm
Mm.
works, but that's all you need is the crazy thing,
Hmm.
right? To do pretty well. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, so I think it's just the point is it explains to me why debate is so central, but it's not for the reason people think it is. People think, oh, great, debate, that's how we like really evaluate ideas, and then we have a democracy because everyone's truly thought about what the best option is and will arrive at that. So all we need to have a democracy is that people are exposed to lots of ideas. But actually, I think that's one of those ideas where if you think about it for more than 3 minutes, it makes no sense. I've thought about many ideas. I've
Mm.
changed my mind based on an idea in the abstract almost never. Certainly not about deeply held political beliefs. Meanwhile, a lot of people are making a lot of money off of like really horribly controversial stuff for exactly the reasons that my video went viral. I mean, I like Me Too, but that's not why it went viral. It went viral for that
Mm.
reason.
Yeah, no, yeah, and I mean, like, we could dig deeper into what you write, for example, in your chapter about, like, taking back Twitter,
Yeah, for sure.
and the ways in which,
There's
like, as you say, the web is not a level playing field,
not at all.
but I think you're really kind of pushing us more in the direction of thinking about debate, the problems with debate, and there's something almost plaintive about like the way Don't Talk About Politics engages with the data about debate and
Yeah,
like communicating for social. You say there's like I'm pining for this bedrock. You say of like the life I knew that is just like I know I can't trust it.
yes.
And you basically say like debates historically, the data shows are totally innocuous.
I don't
They
know if they're
compress.
innocuous because that sounds that they're not doing a harm. I think they're worse than innocuous, Scott.
They're worse than okay.
They're
Like
like
so, they're not
they're
effective,
not
and in fact,
effective. They're
they're
not changing
destructive.
anyone's political views, but they are shredding.
Right.
And actually, I remember because I read through this chapter recently. They are. I say something like they are shredding the social fabric as they generate entertainment, right? And I
Right.
think that's really dangerous because, as it turns out, the social fabric, and by this I mean our long-standing connections with other people, our reliance on each other, our willingness to have long-form conversations with people that we at least somewhat disagree with or have different life experiences from, that is super important for democracy. And the more that we debate, the less we do that, both in terms of time
Mm,
trade-offs and also because it generates a kind of something between friction and like relationship destroying energy.
mhm.
And I'm not
Yeah.
saying this, by the way, to be like kumbaya. Like, I am
Mm,
fundamentally in many ways a person who believes that we do have political enemies, right?
mhm,
Interestingly, to go back to Sophie's work, she writes about that too, right? We do have political
mhm,
enemies, all of us. We have people who fundamentally want a thing that is incompatible with our own well-being or goals, and sometimes we cannot just like negotiate a compromise about that. And in particular, I
mhm,
would say the number one thing that we should think about in terms of our enemies is almost everyone on earth fundamentally is an enemy, has as their enemy people who are at the very top of the capitalist system, right? And I mean that not in a conspiracist way. I mean that in terms of like literal billionaires, especially the billionaires that are extractive or manipulating the political world, right? All of them,
mhm,
but like
mhm,
you can see some of them behaving extra poorly. Um,
mhm,
right? And we all, and
mhm,
we
mhm.
just have enemies, and I don't say this because I'm like, ah, yes, I am bloodthirsty, or like, ah, yes, I want just to cause drama and friction. No, I'm saying this because until we understand that there are people who are fundamentally opposed to our interests and cannot be reconciled to us with words alone, we cannot really understand the shape of the political problem. We can then have an interesting debate about whether we are going to re educate these people like a Maoist, chop off their head, send them to Mars as they so desire, or whatever. But, like, we have enemies. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and so, but also most of the people on this planet I feel are uh only conditionally our enemies, right? Like a lot of people are,
Sure.
they might become our enemies if they really dig in their heels and insist on doing a thing, but like, most people are actually just not that well politically educated, and there are meaningful ways to engage with them to a degree. It's just not what liberal baby Sarah Stein Lubrano thought back when she was 15 years old and in her civics class or whatever.
Right. And like the thing that you seem to suggest is difficult about like being denied this sort of fiction about debate in some senses that the appeal of it comes from the distinction and the like nobility that it gives people who participate in it, and those folks are often maybe the more powerful, educated in society. They're
Yeah,
already
great.
perhaps privileged. They're positioned to debate. I think that's really important. Like the revolutionary power of discourse is really always attenuated by these hierarchies of like
Yeah,
class
this
and
is
distinction and all that stuff, right?
yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, I would say, like, I think something that was an interesting and fine line to walk in this book, right, is if I was writing for a different audience, if I was writing for like the grumpy men of the historical materialism conference, then I could just put it this way. I could say, uh, there is a kind of habitus that is generated by different class positions, and unfortunately, comrades that have PhDs, we actually have the wrong habitus for some of the skills that are now needed, right? Okay, but I don't write
Mhm.
like that because I honestly don't see a
No,
point. Um, what I
no.
really
When
try
you
to
introduce habitus, you make it so clear. Like
yeah,
it's just brilliant how clear it is. Yeah.
yeah. I don't write like that because I'm writing for a group of, firstly, a different group of people, and secondly, I actually believe that part of the goal of the writer isn't just to say the thing that is true, but to say it in a way that it is approachable to the person that needs to approach it, you know? And what I
Yeah.
really want to say, and I think it's easy for me to sympathize with this group of people because I have been them, is like, hey, I too once lived in a world of liberal ideals and they were beautiful to me, right? Some of them were really beautiful to me. Like I thought it was such an amazing idea that this thing I also really happened to enjoy, which was like reading books for funsies and having chats with my friends about it. I loved the idea that that was also going to liberate me, right? It's by
Mm,
itself that I
mhm,
was going to like acquire truth and that everyone else could also acquire truth that way and that that was the main thing that we were going to have to do. What a cool idea. It
mhm.
just happens to be completely sociologically false. Almost entirely
Right.
false anyway, right? I think we should all be
Yeah.
reading books and talking to our friends about books. I even think we should talk about politics, but that's not the means by which we produce political change in this world. And as you'll see in the book, what does produce political change is building certain kinds of relationships and environments where we can have those kinds of long form relationships as equals with others that we are different from but have shared goals with. That's the
Mhm,
bedrock of democratic life, right? And then the other bit of democratic life, obviously, is about our action possibilities. What's actually available to
mhm.
us to try out as an idea in the world, to do the idea. And then later you can think the idea also, right? That's how we evaluate an idea. And I think there are really profoundly ideas that you can only understand by doing them, right? I also believe that, which is not a common intellectual presupposition, but I do feel that there are experiences humans need to have to entertain certain ideas for the most part, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
love this move that you make
yeah, and
in the
and
book,
and
you know?
without like once that's true, then democracy has to look different. I think very obviously it has to have a profound material underpinning that is obviously not available right now. Like most people do
Mhm.
not have the material options that they can explore different possibilities for their life and say like, you know, cool, but what if I didn't live in the family? Or what if I didn't, you know, whatever, right? People are do
Yeah.
not experience that form of freedom, material,
Mhm.
action-based freedom. Um, so what I'm trying to say, to zoom out again just for a second and answer your point, is that look, there's a
Yeah.
group of people on this planet that are, if we are going to use the Marxist jargon that I enjoy, the professional managerial class who holds a
Right.
certain kind of liberal ideals. They were like, wow, I'm so smart and cool and special. And I like did an extra special grade in my class. And then I went to a university where I felt special because I read a bunch of cool books. And look, I'm you too. I also went to very fancy schools that were not as important as they sound. And I read a bunch of fancy books and I loved the books. And that's not how you show love for an idea. The way you show love for an idea is to
Mm,
do it. And
mm.
what I think this is really hard for many people, what makes it hard to take this on board, including for me, and this is a thing I've had to work through, so now I'm writing a book about it, right? Is I wrote a book about it, is that it means that it's not it is special that we love ideas intellectually, but it's not quite as special as we thought because there's this other thing we have to do. And that other thing is not the thing that we were told would make us unique and special and gifted and important and elite and better than others. Because the other stuff is like, hey, are you good at resolving conflict in groups or maybe reaching out to your neighbors or doing small tasks to help people so that you form a community? Or could you help people have a new experience so that later they can for themselves put together an idea of what they want to see as justice in the world? You know, that's a very different set of skills. um, I almost want to say it's a more working class set of skills, but I think it's hard to generalize to that degree right now, especially in a world where actually class is quite a complicated set of signifiers that are fairly
Mm.
intersecting and nebulous for a lot of people. But the point is
Mhm.
it's not the idealized one, right? Much
Right.
more pragmatic. And um I could have written a whole other book just about this. I think this is a really interesting problem. Like how do you love your your new ways of thinking as you develop them and still hold yourself to be important and let go of this other set of status signifiers attached to just like pure in quotes intellectual thought.
Yeah. And is there a degree of even like joy and relief in letting letting those things go maybe?
Yeah, for me
I just
too there is.
yeah,
Yeah. What about you?
yeah. I mean, for me, I have experienced a ton of relief
Mhm.
in being able to, actually try and make these ideas like manifest in the world. I have genuinely felt relief, especially in like joining a team rather than being this, adrift academic.
Yes.
So a lot of what you're saying in the book resonates with me because of that experience. Um, where you're saying like we do need to kind of dismantle debate as this enshrined notion and kind of like rebuild the public sphere or maybe build it might not exist anymore, like build something,
Yeah.
And like there's a warmth in the book,
Mhm.
I guess, that I find really compelling.
Oh yeah.
And it comes to the fore maybe most when you're talking about, I think, social contact theory,
Hmm.
and the political power of just friendships, which I've been thinking about a ton since reading the book,
Mm.
because I'm pretty introverted myself and obviously value the friendships that I have, but struggle for a number of reasons in the public sphere, knowing how to navigate those dynamics, right?
Hmm.
And I wondered if you could maybe talk a bit about those four key factors that you list in the book
Yeah.
for increasing solidarity across lines of difference. They're kind of spelled out in social contact theory, and you just like you're kind of wrestling with why it is that it's these four factors in particular that seem to provide like the ideal conditions for some kind of relationship building that you might not even have been able to imagine before that situation happened.
And yeah, I just wanted to go back to things about warmth. I think this is true, and I do think it actually um it fits in with the thing I said about how I actually like the public. Like a joke I often have is that a lot of public intellectuals don't like the public. I like the public. I know they have a lot of
Right.
problems, and there are a couple of fascists in there, and like yes, they're going to say stupid things to you on Instagram, but I'm fundamentally committed to actually liking the public. I'm interested in what they think, and I think they matter as much as I do. Um, but
Hmm.
here's another. But yeah, so let's get on to social contact theory. It's also that I'm trying to embody the thing that I write about. Like, why should anyone take me seriously? First of all, if I don't seem to like them, and secondly, if I'm not actually doing the thing I just said was a
Right.
good idea,
Yeah.
which is to which is to embody the conditions under which you can have meaningful relationships of equals, right?
Hmm.
So, social contact theory, it's drawn from something that actually it's more Googleable, I find, if you write social contact hypothesis for some reason. And also, if you
Hmm.
write social contact theory, you get social contract theory, which is a boring form of liberal theory that is not what I'm writing about. So, anyway, the
Hmm.
social contact hypothesis. Yeah, it's a bunch of research that began right after World War II in the United States when they integrated the military, which was a big deal back then, right? Because during World War
Sure.
II, black soldiers fought in separate units, and I think there were also other races in different units. I don't, I mean, race is such a bad category, so it drives me crazy to
Yeah.
say that. But anyway, fine, that's what was going on, obviously, and then finally they said, oh, maybe they could serve like in the same units. And since the U.S. is an imperial form, let's be real, there were many wars
Hmm.
after where people served together. Like in the Korean War, people served suddenly in the same unit in a lot of cases, right? And even though I don't like what the U.S. military is up to pretty much all of the time, it's still a great place to do the sociological research. Let's give it that.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, for
because they
sure.
could really measure, like, are these soldiers becoming less prejudiced against the other groups they're serving with? And the answer was yes, but only in certain conditions. And here are the conditions. I'm actually going to quote it from my book so I get it right, because on another podcast the other day I didn't fudge, but I was like, oh, what is it? So firstly, members of the different groups making contact should have equal status in the environment they're in. That's like in practice, right? And one of the examples I
Hmm.
give people is, okay, if you're in a company and there are people of color but they all have like the worst jobs, I that doesn't count, right? Because
That's just
they,
reproducing.
yeah,
Yeah,
the company is not
exactly.
saying, "Oh yes, we value people of color who are equals to you," really, right? Even if they say that
No.
officially, they're not saying that in reality. So,
Right.
number two, they should meet in situations where cooperation is regularly required and where they have goals in common. I find goals in common super interesting. How interesting is that?
Yeah.
And it's interesting
Yeah. Yeah.
partially because of the internet. I mean, I think it's interesting for a lot of reasons, actually. It kind of puts you on the same side of the question of like, are we enemies or are we friends? Right? But also, it's interesting because there are a lot of forms of social life right now that we pretend are democratic, but people don't actually have shared goals. Like, what on earth is your shared goal on Twitter? Oh my lord. There is no shared goal.
Fair.
It is only
No.
conflict and friction. It's horrible. Like, it's actually part of why I personally a little bit more enjoy Instagram, even though I get some of the same nonsense on Instagram. Obviously, I get people screaming at me in the
Sure.
comments of the video that went viral, but I find that people a little bit more sometimes think they have a shared goal, which is to like find interesting stuff and share it with my friends. And it's just like a slightly different vibe. But on the whole, I would
Yeah.
say the internet bad for this. We are not doing a shared goal on the internet. You know who have shared
Hmm.
goals? People who are in the PTA together, the Parents Teacher Association, right?
Yeah.
People who are in the housing association together, people who have a food co-op together, people who in some cases, I don't want to like blanket endorse religion here, but some religious groups you do have a shared goal and you could do some civic life together, etc. Okay. Number three, close relationships should be possible. That matters because obviously, like, if you look at something like Amazon, right? Amazon is very careful to make sure no one ever gets to have a close relationship at work.
Too dangerous.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, even as far as I understand in the sort of like upper level jobs, but definitely for the people they're worried about unionizing. They make them all come in at
Yeah.
like different shifts all the time and not even commute together. It's a nightmare.
Sure.
Why? Because these relationships are powerful.
Mhm.
Once you meet
Mhm.
somebody and you have like a long form chat with them, and I get into some kinds of these what these long form chats might look like later in the book, then now you are political together, or you have the capacity to be, right? And you overcome your
That's right.
prejudices also. And then number four, contact between groups should be legitimized through institutional support. I really feel like this is a variant on number one. But
Mhm.
I think it
Mhm.
does seem to matter, basically. You could have these other conditions and maybe, if there's already a lot of prejudice, you probably also need the institution to explicitly say, hey, like, I mean, here's the exact example. Like in the US military, we now think you guys are equally valuable and we are going to treat you the same. And we like really stand
Mhm.
by this. I mean, I hate to make the US military the good guys here, but whatever. There are a lot of institutions that could do this work, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and look, to be sentimental, and I am occasionally a sentimental person, these are beautiful because they're also the conditions for friendship, like meaningful friendship.
Yeah.
Friendship where you have a relationship, and this is something I'm working on a lot in my next book, that is fundamentally not transactional. Right? You're not there
Right.
so that you can do an exchange and leave. Even if you are at work,
Yeah.
you are having to exchange and leave, but like the way you're having the relationship with the other person there is not transactional because you recognize each other as equals, you're positioned that way explicitly and implicitly. You're going to have long form conversations about your real life and you have goals in common, which means you have a reason to continuously be in a relationship with that person where you're not just trying to get something out of them, but you're trying to actually the relationship is the point, not the transaction, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of where we become friends. Or, I mean, if we were going to put like left theory hat on again, where we become comrades, which in a way is a political form of friendship in a certain sense. Yeah.
Our comrade Max Haven has pointed out
Yeah.
that billionaires, the existence of billionaires is itself violent, right?
Hmm.
And so we might have the shared goal of, creating a world without billionaires. We might have that radical goal, but we might have like a very prosaic, quotidian goal, right? Of just like ensuring that, the kids in your co-op are fed. Like, who knows, right? Either way, the point seems to be that the conditions for a kind of democratic infrastructure where people do feel heard, seen, empowered are complicated. Creating those conditions are not easy from
Yeah.
your perspective. And so I think it might be interesting to kind of dwell for a minute with like the concept of infrastructure, which you spend a little bit of time talking about.
Great. Yeah.
It's a really rich concept. People don't talk enough about it.
I
When they think
know.
infrastructure, you're right. They
Yeah.
think like hard infrastructure. They think concrete. But what you're
They think
talking about
plumbing,
really
right? It's the
are
worst.
what's that?
They think plumbing.
They think plumbing, the guts of a building.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. I get
They
why
don't
it's
think
not.
third spaces. They don't think affordable coffee shops. They don't
They
think
don't, right?
libraries,
Mostly.
you know? And if you're not sentimental about that, you're certainly sympathetic to the idea of just like trying with everything we've got to really invest in those spaces because that physical social infrastructure matters,
Yeah.
and I think like that's a really powerful practical takeaway from the book, and something that you're also iterating on Putnam to try and understand. Like it's not just about bowling alone.
Yeah.
It's about like what are the conditions under which we can create new forms of play and organization, all that stuff
Good.
together,
Yeah,
right?
let's gently trash
Yeah.
Putnam because I think he's a great way to get into the infrastructure. So,
Let's do
okay, not trash. That's the wrong word. Look, I just disagree with
gently. The qualifier gently
gently.
is
Yeah, like
key.
Putnam is really sweet. He's just really wrong about this. I feel that he has done the correct analysis and he has taken away the wrong approach, and that happens all the time in social science.
Sure,
um,
because you bring yourself to the writing. Like I think that's what's going on in Putnam, right?
yeah, he's brought himself to the writing. Also, like, look, Putnam is 85 years old, and to be honest with you, if you like if you lived in that set of years, it kind of makes sense, especially if you got to be like a really fancy Harvard professor and have a nice life and live in the global
Mm,
north in that very particular way. You it makes sense that you felt that this might be possible, right? And
yeah,
actually, there's bits of his writing. I mean, I don't want to, I'm not just going to trash. Like, I think it is really interesting that human beings in America have historically had a lot more club memberships. That's fascinating. Great.
it is.
Like, I think,
Yeah,
and, like, we probably should have more club memberships. It's just that that's not really working right now. And why is a really important question. Because
Mm.
Putnam's last film, which I hilariously watched with like a very varied group of like European PhD holders, is this incredibly sentimental, incredibly American film about how we should all join a club, right? And he gets
Mm.
into like a lot of this research about how we're losing our social connections, and that's not democratic and that's bad. And he's right. Except I'm
Mm.
not sure if joining a club is going to cut it, and I'm not even sure that the club is the right place to intervene in this problem. Because I think there's an important question of why aren't people in clubs? Well, why aren't people in clubs?
Mm.
Okay, first of all,
It's a good question.
right. Let me think about why I'm not in clubs. I'm not in clubs because I'm working a lot. I'm working a lot. I'm publicizing this book. I'm writing
Sure.
the next book. I'm doing another thing. Like, right. So I'm working a lot.
Hmm.
I'm not in a club because the way the global economy works, I moved a zillion miles away from everything I ever knew to work in a different place. And actually, that can often happen. People get disrupted. They're no longer living in as small communities. But interestingly, I'm going to talk about some data that gives a different picture in a second. So let's not commit too hard to that as an explanation.
Sure, sure.
um, why am I not in a club? I'm not in a club because I, it's actually kind of expensive to leave my house. Like, and I do it a lot as it happens, but every time I go on even going on the London Tube is kind of expensive. And a lot of people face way higher costs leaving their house. It's actually really hard to leave your house. Exhausting, right? Um,
Yeah.
I'm not in a club because, I could go on and on. But then you need to also look at data. And I think basically the fundamental thing with Putnam is that Putnam is a little bit allergic to economic explanations for things. And he's
Right.
also really in love with graphs. And I think both of these things have misled him because economic explanations are not just like this graph moved before this graph, therefore causation. There are other ways of thinking about what is economics. So Putnam says in his latest book, he says it's not economics because we can actually see the shift into greater inequality happen after the shift, where people went into these like individuating lifestyles, and so obviously the economics didn't cause the individualism. And I
Mm.
think there's something to that, in that there probably was an individualism happening for some time before we saw some of these economic shifts. But to me, as a Marxist, those things are not really that separable. If you're already building a market economy with a nuclear family, you can individuate people for quite some time before the economy itself begins to produce that kind of income inequality. But all of that is the economy to me, right?
Hmm.
And he just doesn't have this lens. He doesn't think, oh yeah, there might be a period of time where people are increasingly seeing themselves as individuals, and then downstream from that, it means that they stop joining unions, and also they vote for individualistic messages in their politicians, who then those politicians deregulate the economy, and then inequality sets in. He doesn't have these things are just too separate for him in a way that isn't, in
Right.
my view, justifiable. So that's one. I think we have a
Yeah.
massive economic inequality problem, and that really does individuate people. And of course it fits into their ideology. Like, for a good Marxist says economics and individuality, economics and your ideology are two parts of the same whole. It's the way you live your life, and that affects your
Sure.
ideas, right? So
Yeah, yeah. But these are just things that he can't factor in necessarily,
I think
right?
liberals have an idealistic attachment to the idea that the way you happen to exist in the economy is somehow going to be unrelated to the way you think about yourself and the world. And that's
Sure.
bananas, because this is not true, and also a very dangerous idea in this case. So I think
Mm.
that fundamentally, like, this is fun. I haven't gotten to talk about this in any part of the book or whatever. And I kind of have a rant about Putnam on my blog, but look, it's just he's not materialist enough in the way he thinks about the world. So he doesn't can imagine that we could be thinking about, like, what's characteristic of this economic system. Oh, it's individualism, and eventually that caught up with us, and then all these other things fell apart, right?
Hmm.
Even before the income inequality really set in, there's still a causation there. So that's one problem. And yeah, I'm very interested in that. Remind me, Scott, where are we driving to? Where are we going here? Because I've gotten far
Well,
Putnam.
yeah, I mean, it's a good question, honestly, because I think like the idea is really infrastructure.
Infrastructure.
Like
Yeah.
he's
Okay. Good.
not really thinking about the materiality of the infrastructure that would facilitate a reproliferation
Yeah.
of those clubs,
So
or even a radicalizing of them, let's say.
yeah.
You know?
So exactly. So then here's the second thing, right? Like, obviously one approach to this problem is to say, okay, it's mostly material. Like, let's have a revolution tomorrow, comrades. But like, again, this isn't a book for the left public. And also, to be honest, I'm not convinced of that approach, in the sense that I don't actually
Mm.
know what, if anything, is going to get us out of this nightmaric, like, economy that we live in right now. I don't know. And
Hmm.
but I do know that infrastructure is going to help, right?
Yeah,
um,
it must. Yeah,
it can't stop.
Because of affordances, right?
Yeah.
Because of that idea of affordances.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so So I wanted to write about that. I also like infrastructure, and let's think about what infrastructure is now that we've made fun of Robert Putnam, right? Infrastructure is like the invisible stuff that makes certain options in the world obvious, natural, easy, maybe even the only thing you could imagine doing. And you can think about like any number of examples, right? Like roads. Okay, I'm probably only ever going to drive to places in London where there are roads that go to there. You know, if there's not a road there, I'm not going there. How am I going to decide where I live in London? It's probably almost entirely based on tube stops. It just is, right?
Mm,
Um, you know, why do rural areas like end up with the systems that they do, or why don't they have Wi-Fi? That's an infrastructure problem. Why a lot
mhm.
of our choices are actually made around the infrastructure, but we don't think about it because they're so powerful that the power of them is basically invisible, right? I think there's a
Yeah.
nice quote in the book from Susan Lee Starr where she just says, you know, it's so powerful that it's invisible, and the best
Mhm.
infrastructure is super invisible to us. I never think about whether I'm going to get water when I turn on the tap. I don't question like, for the most part, because I'm busy, why does the Victoria line go here? You know, but these are big, powerful
Mhm.
questions. And you can really see
Yeah.
it in London, even, you know, any city really. The infrastructure is actually built for the people in power and for what they wanted, which in London was like, we would like commuters in the Victorian era to go to work in a particular way. And now in the 21st century, you know, it's we can't really build more infrastructure easily, so we're just going to make poor workers live in these horrible exurbs, and they're going to have horrible career like commutes rather, right? Also careers
Mhm.
potentially, but never mind.
Right.
And and so the point is, infrastructure is one of the locuses of power, and I think it's also a good place to start because, again, if you talk to a lot of people that are more absorbed in like traditional ideas about democracy and civics, they would say power lies with the government. We
Mm.
now live in a world where power is actually pretty widely distributed among a bunch of other things that act often as powerfully as states. Look at this election. Look at Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And not just Elon Musk, but really like a whole cabal, basically, of billionaires who just bought their place at the table in various ways. This is why
Mhm.
Mark Zuckerberg bends over and gets on board. Why? Because in a way these are like, you know, I mean, you can debate whether like techno feudalism is a good analysis, but these are other powerful actors that behave in quasi state like ways and deeply influence the state for their own good, right? And
Right.
so, and one of the reasons they're powerful is because they are the infrastructure, you know?
That's it. I
And
think that's it.
yeah, that's it. And so I would rather give people a new place to locate power and then try to disrupt it or change it or provide an alternative to it. And to me, that is just as important in democracy as anything I could ever tweet or that could ever go viral. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and what you say in the book, if I can quote it on this point,
Mm,
is it is more psychologically productive to ask if we want to create a world where certain actions are possible, right?
mm.
Where people can work a bit less, choose and change their gender expression, afford university, or move countries easily. Like, you know, communicating at that, like on that register of infrastructure and its affordances changes people's minds to some extent if you do it in the right way. Like I've seen it firsthand
Mhm.
because it seems to open things up. And you know, my main occupation is like climate communication
Mm.
work at the municipal government level. And when it comes to the massive challenge of climate change, you're especially adamant that it really can't just be about discourse and debate anymore. It's
Yeah,
just not
yeah,
going anywhere, you know? And you write that there are some things we can only learn, in fact, through our attempts to change the world. You've kind of touched on that already in this conversation.
mm.
But on climate, you say to change people's views on the importance of climate change, it may be more effective to provide incentives for them to install a solar panel on their roof
Yeah, but notably, I
and
don't
to
mean
argue
financial
with them
incentives, right?
with that.
I don't mean financial incentives, and I wanna be clear here because I think this research is
Oh,
super
interesting.
important. So
That's kind of how I read it.
oh, no, yeah, but I think that's just me writing sloppily for one moment in the book. But in an earlier bit of the book, I talk about which incentives work, and
Mm,
amazingly, when they tried different things to get people to, like, install heat pumps, because you know, heat pumps are much
mhm.
more effective than aircon, and they use less energy, and basically, we need to all be having air pumps eventually, right? Sorry, heat
Yeah.
pumps, and anyway, they were like, "How can we motivate people to do this?" Basically, to make an infrastructure investment upfront in their home. Because it kinda sucks. You have to, like, probably take out a loan. It's stressful, right? You will get
Mhm.
it paid back over time, but that's hard. And so they were like, "Can we pay people to do this?" Not that effective, interestingly, right? Uh, can we you know, give them a lot of information? I mean, the information action gap is huge. Like, it has almost no effect whether people have more information about the
Yeah.
heat pump. They don't care. What is the number one predictor of whether they will install a heat pump? You should know by now, having read the book. It's their friends. If their friend installs a heat
That's right.
pump, they will install a heat
Yeah.
pump. Why? Because
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
like, okay, this isn't that weird, first of all. Secondly,
Yeah.
Scott did it, and that means if I have a problem with my heat pump, I'm gonna call Scott and be like, "Hey, did your heat pump do a weird thing? How does this work?"
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
Um, it's now the thing that's being done. So I mean
Interesting.
incentives in this sense, really, more than anything. It's not I mean, fine,
Oh,
of
so
course,
like
money is a
social
problem.
incentives, you could argue,
Love that,
right?
but, like, that's not actually as effective as just giving them the action possibility to try out alongside a person that they trust. And I think a lot of things are like that. I've been thinking a lot about it with the food co-op that I'm now in. And I was talking to Shiri like, "Oh, how can we make more food co-ops?" And her answer was like, "What you need in each case is somebody to be like, 'Hey, I've done this and it's totally doable.'" And that makes complete
Hmm.
sense to me because that's actually what I
Yeah.
need to do anything in life, you know?
You need someone to like steward it, I
Yeah,
guess,
I
on
feel like
some
look,
level.
here's a really boring example, right? Like, there are so many technologies that are available to me, and I am exhausted. I don't want to try any new technologies ever again. I want to lie down
Same.
on the floor and, like, look at the ceiling and maybe turn on the fan, right? I don't want another technology. But sometimes in life, I'm gonna have to try a new technology for, like, work or whatever, and the main
Mhm.
way that I get myself to do a new technology is I find a friend who has that technology, and I say, like, "Hey, Fred, show me." Right?
Show me how it
And it's
works,
not
yeah.
just that I want the explanation because I could find that via YouTube. I want someone else to be like, "Oh, this is doable and useful. I'm gonna tell you how it's useful. I'm here for you. If you have a question, you can write me. We're doing this together. We're both gonna have this, like, weird app that does this thing that's actually kind of useful in the long run."
Durable, visible commitments to a particular action tend to spread, right? So if you're
Yeah.
kind of putting up a flag and say, hey, I'm doing vermicomposting, then
Yeah.
it tends to spread.
Mhm.
Um, but the way that ideas seem to not spread so much as you've touched on in this conversation and you talk about extensively in the book, is via the web. And I mean, like, it's funny that the chapter on Twitter
Yeah.
actually predicts this falling out between Trump and Elon Musk.
Yeah, yeah, I knew right when I rewrote this chapter.
I found that hilarious. I'm sorry. You
Great.
write,
No, it's great.
should he not have a falling out with Trump, and he may well have by the time this book is
Hell
published,
yeah.
he may be able to take apart the federal government and all its funds from academic and medical.
Yeah.
Like you called it.
We got the
And
stupidest and funniest of both worlds. Like, we both had the federal government stupidly dismantled, and we also got to watch them have a, like, breakup that was the maturity level of 12-year-old girls.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's mean
Where
for
he
girls. Girls and boys, whoever, whatever. 12-year-olds of all genders
petty,
are immature. Or
vindictive,
better than this, actually.
cutthroat, immature people, right?
Yeah.
Like this is who we're talking about.
Yeah.
But not just anybody. I mean, like this is a bromance that falls apart
Yeah.
at a moment after Musk has fully taken over Twitter, which from your perspective drew the ire of people because, quote, the company Musk owns is a vehicle for the public to engage in activities that are central to public life. There's an intuitive sense you say that something like Twitter should be an important free service not owned by a belligerent radicalized billionaire. Um, this chapter is characteristic of the book as a whole in a sense because you're dwelling to some extent in that ambivalence about the idea that Twitter could be a public sphere,
Yeah.
right? You kind of know
I'm
that
letting
it's
it save the
not.
romance for a second, and then I'm like, "Okay,
The romance,
no more romance."
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, so it feels like you're kind of wrestling with what it meant that Musk was able to buy a what seemed to be a democratic public sphere. He was just able to buy it.
Yeah.
So, it's like, how do we attack Musk for shitifying Twitter while also being self reflexive about the actual political impact of social media?
Yeah, and I think more than that, I think, like, it's just such a paradigmatic thing to me in a way, right? That Twitter,
Yeah.
like, because look, if we were, aliens from outer space, they could come down, the aliens could come down and they could say, like, "Why are you sad about this website?" And we would be like, "Because the website was meant to embody our ideals about how we wish to relate to each other." And the aliens would be like, "Oh, good, so did everyone behave really well on the website?" And we would be like, "No." And then the
Not so
aliens would
much.
say, "Ah, well, why did you think it would be a democracy? Is it because you all own a part of the website?" And we would be like, "No." In fact, one rich guy who was really terrible owned the website, and, like, before that, it was a bunch of other rich guys, basically. And then slowly the romance of it falls apart as the aliens, who are in this case somehow benevolent and intelligent, ask us more questions. It doesn't make any sense really that we thought Twitter was going to go well. The reason that it
Mm,
felt like it could go well is because we have this liberal mystique of the marketplace of ideas, and we desperately wanted to embody it on a website that I think
yeah.
was originally for, like, coders to share coding ideas, which is
Mm,
completely different,
hmm.
like, set of issues. And I mean, I was enjoying the other day listening to a completely different kind of podcast about technology where technology reporters who, don't particularly share any of my political concerns necessarily, were saying that they actually thought it was really funny that Twitter did so well because it was one of those apps that completely succeeded by accident. That like every
Mm.
single good thing that like good in the sense of like useful feature, um, on Twitter was created by the users, the hashtag, that all the stuff we really like about it as users was like user generated. The guys at the top were doing nothing the whole time, more or less, was accidentally succeeding, even from the perspective of like, tech pro journalists. It's not a
Hmm.
political opinion here, right? So I guess the point is like anything that you romanticize, you should be suspicious of. And one of the moves I like to make repeatedly in my
I
writing,
like
because I
that.
am a sentimental person, but I'm also a skeptical person, is to say, "Oh, I love something so much. Why is that? Why do I
Sure.
romanticize that? What does it mean about me? And does that make sense?" And I think with Twitter, it does not make any sense unless one
Hmm.
day we had a different Twitter, right? We
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
really made the Twitter of our dreams because it was always owned by a bunch of shareholders doing a different project badly, as it turned out. They didn't make much money. And it was sellable to Elon Musk. And also it had a bunch of other problems baked in from the start. But anyway, um, but it shows that we do have this longing, I think, for this kind of discourse.
That's right.
And yeah, also then we should be skeptical about that discourse that we supposedly love. What does it mean? Like, why is that the game we want to play rather than go put the solar panels on the roof with our neighbors? Why are we so eager to yell into the void about climate change? And I think
Mm.
then there's the romanticism of the like highly educated person who thinks that their words are the reason they will be most loved and valued instead of
Right.
whatever else they can do, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Which I
If
I
I
am
can,
deeply guilty of because I wrote a book.
yeah, and like you say, like sometimes there isn't a takedown argument. Like sometimes you can't just dunk on somebody and like gloat and like you've won. Like virtually never, like it's not productive
Yeah,
necessarily either.
and I think the other question is like, is that really, I mean, maybe as somebody whose video just went viral, like I received many dunking comments, and some of them were funny. Like part
Mm.
of me was like, oh yeah, you got me, dude. But like, so who cares? Like, what? This
Yes.
is what?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, it's like political theater to some extent. You talk about this interesting example toward the beginning of the book, the so-called Great Debate in
Oh yeah,
France.
that's
To me, this is like an interesting case of like there are all these things like mass reading events, Canada Reads, where like we fight over what the best book is and like or who the greatest Canadian was or whatever,
weird.
and yeah, and it's supposed to be this like mass national spectacle of debate that's akin to what happened, I suppose, in France.
Okay.
But you say like in practice, it's just a faulty assumption that the debate is going to reveal the truth. I
Well,
mean,
yeah, I mean,
yeah.
let's go back to the very beginning of the book. At the very beginning of the book, the first thing I write about is the requiramento, right? Which is this
Mm.
like super weird thing that basically came out of the concerns of a small number of Franciscan friars who kind of began to read about what was happening when the new world in quotes was being colonized by the Spaniards and said, "Hey, it sounds like there's a bunch of like murder and rape happening, and that seems bad, right?" Which is a
Hmm.
reminder that in any time period there are always people that are opposed to the like ongoing genocide, right?
Yeah.
And so to satisfy them, the Spanish state came up with this 1,000-word statement. And they were like, oh, it's going to be fine because we're going to disseminate an idea that any rational person could accept. And then they'll get on board with our political program. And if they don't, it's like totally their fault, right? And then this thousand
Mm.
word statement, which was read to people in a language they didn't understand at all and not translated for them in many cases, says, oh, by the way, God, who is our God, gave us this land, which I assume you immediately understand why that is real. And also the king gets the land, please, thanks. And if you resist, we will rape your wives and enslave everyone. Which is just a threat. I mean, I think there's
That's
something funny. Even at the heart
straight
of this, there's
threat.
like a brief theological argument that would make no sense to somebody in another culture, even if it was translated. And then there's like a threat, right? But I
Hmm.
actually
Hmm.
think a lot of discourse works like that. Somebody powerful encounters like a moment where they could accidentally upset some people that it's politically inconvenient for them to upset. So they say, "Don't worry, we're going to have discourse about it and that will make everything fair." And then they make a fake discourse that's often actually a threat of like if you don't get on board, you're just in the wrong.
Hmm.
And that's it. And I think that you can actually see that a lot of debate and discourse is a veneer of legitimacy for the structures of power that are going to happen exactly the same regardless. I think this is part of why we got the like, I mean, there are many reasons, but like why we got the Trump Musk alliance because Trump's favorite toy and Musk's favorite toy was the same, like, insanity-inducing debate world, and that
Mm-hmm.
was Twitter, right? They both loved this toy so much, they loved it so much that Musk bought it and broke it, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the reasons they liked it, in my view, is that it provided for them a veneer of legitimacy for what they wanted to have happen, right?
Yeah.
And
Not just
yeah.
form, but like a very visible, like large following that seemed to legitimate them on that
Yeah, and
platform,
it's
right?
super ego-inducing. Again, let's talk about virality. Like, it's super ego-inducing,
Yeah.
that first moment where you're like, "Oh my god, everyone loves this, yay!" But the thing is those dudes got it all day long, every single day, for years and years and
Right.
years in this, like, vortex, and they also
Yeah.
got to then dunk on other people. And as it turns out, again, to use the sociology world, it doesn't really seem like Twitter affected the election that deeply, you know? It's
Mm,
not that it changed many people's voting intentions. It's just that I think it was very useful to both of these men to legitimate both their internal psychological world and to do a certain social function of like, no, no, we have all debated all the things, you know?
mm.
Um, and I almost wish I had said more about that in the book, but I think it comes across slowly, and I hope that people absorbed it, really.
No, and like I'd love to hear, or read a whole chapter on like the liberal critique of the manosphere that happened after Trump was elected,
Right, the liberals were like, "Oh,
with videos of Theo
there's a lot of
Vaughn and Joe Rogan and
yeah,
so on, right?
if we can just get rid of, like, those guys, then maybe our toy can
That's
be okay." Because it was also liberals' favorite toy. They were like, "This is our favorite toy. We want this toy so much." Ah.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
And I sympathize. And, to be honest, like, I am absolutely guilty, but I tend to write about things that I'm guilty about. Like, I liked Twitter too.
Mm,
I enjoyed being on the Twitter. I got to see people have
mm,
beef in real time. I had 13,000 followers at one point. I mean, I barely use Twitter anymore. I basically just repost some things so people know where they can find me. But
mm,
like, it's a thing, right? It
right.
was it was a potent force, but the question is, what was it a force for, and what was it doing? Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I was hoping you would talk about that realization in the book that you seem to have, that you come to, that organizing protests today might be too easy, that we might need to ask more of people than we do
yeah.
in these contexts. Could you talk about that in relationship to some of these high profile movements that you
Of course,
discussed?
yeah. So look, I mean, one of the things that happens that is unfortunate when you do a lot of like data driven research, um, and you're trying to solve a problem and you care more about solving the problem than whether humans are going to like applaud after each point, is that you discover things that are actually quite tricky to get across, right? And so an
Mm,
unfortunate thing that happened to me in the process of writing this book is I read a bunch of data about whether demonstrations, and I'm saying this just to clarify because sometimes protest, you have like a big umbrella for that word, right? And underneath is strikes
right.
and also like, I don't know, blockades of harbors, and also like a lot of things that fit under
Sure.
protest. And I don't mean these very specific like economic, kind of almost like in a good way warlike measures. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking
Yeah.
about demonstrations where you go out and basically make a lot of noise, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so I went to look at the research on demonstration driven led protest. Does this change anyone's minds? Because I've been in many demonstrations in my life.
Exactly.
Uh,
Yeah.
and the answer is no, basically, in the sense, except with one exception, which we'll get to in a second. And so the question is, okay, does it change the public's mind? And it does not change the public's mind in a long term way, right? All the data we've got, we're looking at, okay, like there were a lot of Black Lives Matter protested people that happened to be near it and see it. Did they seem to have a bigger shift than people that weren't near it or didn't see it? No. Even when you measure, control for various things. Okay, did the public's opinion change in the long term about this thing? No. Uh, and
Mm,
so on. And Black Lives Matter is actually a great example. To be clear, like I am very much on board in general with the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm not trashing them for some weird niche like grumpiness about them. It's not about that. It's actually that they were one of the most likely candidates for a protest that did change people's minds, because for a while we did see a change in public opinion around that time.
measurable. Yeah.
Yeah, which is unusual, and social scientists got really excited, but actually now we're back to the baseline that we were at before that movement ever got started. And in fact, we've
Right.
done something even more annoying where like Democrats are slightly more skeptical of police, and but like Republicans love them even more. So we're just
Yeah.
they almost worse than progress in some ways. Um,
Mm,
and yeah, so that is simply not, it is simply not the case that we see demonstration leading to changes in public opinion from outsiders looking at the movement, right? Awareness for a
Hmm.
brief period of time, sure. Temporary fluctuations, maybe. Long-term change, we do not see this. We also don't
Mm.
see necessarily changes in government policy, which actually really shouldn't surprise anyone, because if you think about it, the government policy firstly tends to be about what like the top 5% of people want, especially in America. And secondly, and importantly, um, the government is doing something for a reason, whatever it's doing. And
Yeah,
demonstrations don't hold anything hostage. I'm sorry to use this metaphor when we have, real sad hostages in the world. But
I
like,
get what you're saying.
yeah,
Like
like
there
then
aren't
why would
stakes
they change the sign?
necessarily.
What? Because you have a
Yeah.
sign? Like,
Right.
you have
Yeah.
to say like, yeah, you can't have what you want, government, because if you try to do that, then you won't have this other thing you also want. And that's not
Right.
what's happening in a demonstration. So okay, so then there is one group of people where demonstration does change their mind a lot permanently, and those people are the protesters. If you are a person who starts out with a certain baseline set of political beliefs, but you happen to get drawn into a protest movement, maybe because you live closer to it, this is how social scientists are trying to like control for all these variables. The people that end up joining a protest movement, those people change their views a lot permanently.
Hmm.
There's like a whole
Hmm.
field of sociological research called the biographical effects research, where they just look at like what happens to someone who joins a protest movement, right? And what happens is that your whole life changes forever.
Hmm. Yeah.
And when I say, by the way, I said some of these biographical effects the other day to a room of climate organizers, and they all like looked genuinely appalled because they saw themselves in it. They were like, "Oh no, it's us!" And here are some of the
That's
effects. Right? You get divorced
right.
more. You
Yeah.
have fewer children. You go back to graduate school a lot. That happens to people a lot that join protest movements. You take lower paying jobs. You become slightly less religious. Not loads less religious, because there's a lot of religion in this world, and you could always just go become like a more cheerful lefty version of it or something. But you become slightly less religious, and so on and so forth. You
Yeah.
earn less money over the course of your life. All the climate people were like, "Oh no, oh no, it's us." Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I sympathize with them.
So
Yeah,
funny.
it's like joining a cult. Your life changes. Maybe it's a friendly cult on a good day, but it is. So okay, so this is unfortunate, right? In a way, because what happens when I say this stuff is I have to say it to rooms of people who love to go on protests, and I feel like a dickhead because I'm kind of telling them
Mm.
like all this stuff that you devoted your life to for years didn't have the effect that you were promising people it would have. And I actually
Hmm.
think this is the hard part. Is like often when I get asked to go on a protest, it's like we need to change the world, and I'm like, cool, is this going to change the world? Right?
Yeah. No. Yeah.
And protest and people who lead protests, it's not I mean, I actually joke about it in the book. Like what they would have to say to people is hey, come on this protest. It will change absolutely no one's mind who doesn't already agree with us. And it will eventually lead to you changing your whole friendship circle and earning less money and maybe having some really bad breakups, but it's going to be awesome. Let's go. This is just not a winning line.
Mm.
Or rather, I would say it could be a winning line, but only when we think about it really deeply. Because actually having your whole
And
life
I
change
think,
is a good thing too sometimes.
I mean, and it just, I don't know. To me, it's, there's a lot that is actually pretty heartening about what you've just
Oh yeah,
described.
tell me more.
And I mean, just the fact that it like, having the experience of finding your people, let's say,
Yeah.
taking on warmongers as a group is something that changes you forever, is
Yeah.
heartening to me, right?
Yeah.
I've had experiences like that. You've had experiences like that. A lot of people I know have had experiences like that, and emotion just comes over them. Like the level of relief that people express is beautiful, I think.
Yeah.
It's obviously not particularly heartening that, like, the truth of it is it can also be a really destabilizing force in your
Yeah.
life that you're going to live a life of probably more cognitive dissonance now than you did in the past.
Yeah. I mean, I am at the end of the day heartened, and I really go back to this at the end of the book, and I say, like, look, if you've magically gotten the whole way through this book, thank you. But also, thanks for keeping me company on this weird journey I went on, where I tried to figure out what does change people's minds. But also, yeah, I mean, I think the way I put it in that chapter on protests is it's also beautiful. Like, yeah, you didn't change the government's minds, because that's a whole other thing about holding stuff that the government wants hostage, right? And it's you didn't change random passerby's mind, because they are busy having their own world of social relationships somewhere else, and they didn't get involved in yours. But you did change yourself forever. And like the truth is that protest movements, demonstration movements end, and crowds go home, but some people are left profoundly changed forever. And as I argue at the end of the book, and in the viral reel that now everyone is mad at me about, but whatever, or not everyone's mad, but that's how the momentum started. At the viral reel
Sure.
that actually a lot of people like, Uh,
Yeah.
and if you become an activist, this is the promise I can give you. To the best of my understanding as a social scientist, if you are in the broad sense on the left and uh, perhaps feeling a little bit sad about the world, not particularly involved in a social movement, joining that social movement will probably make you happier and feel more fulfilled in the long run, right? I mean, it matters
Mm.
which social movement you join. Try not to join a cult, try not to join, whatever. But actually, on average, people who join social movements after already feeling sad about the state of the world are happier. And I don't say this because
Yeah.
I'm like hashtag self-care. Like, I'm not, that's not that basic. It's just that is the solution, is to feel like you have taken a little bit of power into your own hands to do something for other people. It is
Yeah.
it is the sweet kernel in the bitter fruit of knowing that the world is fucked up.
That's right.
Yeah, that's
And like, if I can quote you again, like what you say is that it's only if changes seem inevitable that our beliefs tend to shift.
yeah, for better and
Like when it's, maybe you could put it like politics finds you, you know.
mhm.
What this means politically, you say, is that a great deal hinges on whether people see their lot as inevitable and unchangeable.
Yeah.
I want a shirt that says that. A great deal hinges on whether people see their lot as inevitable and
I think
unchangeable.
that's right.
The whole idea with these action possibilities, giving people experiences, tools, spaces, is that it can dislodge that feeling of inevitability that makes us so miserable for good reason, you know?
Yeah.
I was reading an interview with a guy named Kyle Spencer who wrote a book called Raising Them Right, which is about Kirk.
Mhm.
And, what he was gifted at, according to Spencer, was gravitating toward power. And he was
Yeah.
very comfortable from an early age with being around the wealthy and the powerful. I mean, the
Yeah, he
media
was born here, he got it
organization.
his job.
Well, yeah. And like, so he creates Turning Point,
Right.
which just manufactures kind of right wing influencer stars by narrowly targeting particular identities, either via sport or fashion or whatever, like this kind of post political move. Um, and the whole goal is to make it divisive, but of course unifying, to create a community of belonging around division.
Yeah.
And they've been incredibly successful, right? It's basically like money for loyalty to your political ideology.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think what I wanted to, the reason why I and many of your readers and certainly my students feel like don't talk about politics is incredibly relevant to this moment, is that you devote an entire chapter to debate,
Yeah.
which, Spencer says Kirk uses debate, but more importantly, he uses those who debate him.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing. He's leveraging debate as a kind of anti-discourse.
Yeah.
Um, and so, what does your research basically show about debate? And, you know, in terms of the diagnosis, what are you saying is perhaps the remedy? Because I struggle sometimes with summarizing the sort of deeper conversations you're trying to advocate for in the book. Because it's, a little bit nebulous in some ways. You're trying to talk about, I
It's
think,
because we haven't
rebuilding
built a culture
democratic
of the
tissues.
right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So let's start with debate. I see debate as a very particular, almost like strange cultural artifact of the very strange version of liberalism that we currently live under. And I mean liberalism, like, again, in this very broad sense. So not, it exists in what Americans call conservatism as well, but it's a philosophy of the individual as the primary political agent, and that has some, I would say, positive aspects. It has, for example, the idea that you have individual rights against even your own legal system and police, and whether or not those are, happen in practice, fine, but that's a nice idea. But it also has many, many negative aspects about it. So individualism in general can be very harmful, especially when it comes to private property, but also in other ways. And debate is a lovely example of what individualism can do, because the basic idea there is that two individuals can just spar and by themselves, kind of detached almost from their social reality or structures of power or anything else, they can come to the truth through a form of essentially like hand-to-hand combat. And the more one looks at this idea, I think the more implausible it seems right off the bat, but a lot of people are profoundly and deeply tied into this idea because it serves a vision of the thinker as best at thinking when they're on their own, fits in with their individualism. And it's also really fun to watch. And I think we need to own this a little bit. For a lot of people, debate is super fun to watch. They love seeing the points that are scored. They're totally drawn into it. They love imagining themselves as the hero of the story where they're the debater and they win, you know? And that's very interesting, and it does not make for good politics because it does not actually sharpen people's thinking a lot of the time. I know many people will write and say, but I had a really great debate once and I changed my mind. Great, but you are, sadly, if that is true, the exception. Because when we look at big data sets about whether people's minds are changed by watching debates, even if they were undecided going in, people's minds are not statistically changed by debates. And what I mean by this, I mean something really specific by this, is that if you combine the study of many, many debates, you see basically an average walk. So, of course, after each individual debate, we see, okay, 2 points up to this person or 2 points down to that person. But if you compare them all over time, there is not evidence that they are moving the dial. That is more or less noise in the statistical data set. They're not moving more that day than they do 5 days later when they've already forgotten about the debate. People are just moving their views around. That's it. And as I demonstrate in my book, that makes sense because the things that do change people's minds that are much more fundamental and powerful than debates are other things, our relationships with other people and our own actions and experiences in the world. And those are so powerful that watching anything on the television is very unlikely to truly be the thing that changes your mind. And we can kind of see this when you kind of hold the data set of the world and shake it and see what falls out, right? Uh, so my argument is debate not doing the thing where it changes people's mind, therefore not this fundamental moving building block of democracy as many people imagine in a liberal democracy, where it's like the tool that changes people's mind, and then the better outcome happens through the election. That's not what's going on. What is going on? What's going on is it's great entertainment, it's super addictive, it fuels our sense of ourselves as powerful via the individual rather than collective action. And obviously, it's a big money spinner, also. I mean, people spend so many hours watching debates, it fuels half of the stuff on social media. Every time I post anything that's even vaguely controversial, that post does better. I've noticed that people are arguing in the comments. I mean, I basically never do better than when I piss people off. And I actually talk about how really, really good users of social media, including some of the worst people you can imagine, like Andrew Tate, have completely cottoned onto this, right? So like Tate always had this theory where he says the best posts he's noticed upset 60% of people, they make 20% of people laugh, and 20% of people agree with them. That is a crazy way to use the internet, but it's incredibly effective. And it is still part of this big, broad structure. At the other end, debate also serves a legitimizing function. And I've noticed people don't really know what the word legitimizing means, so I'm going to be really specific here. I do not mean if you have debated something, the outcome is the morally legitimate thing. I mean, it provides the appearance of legitimacy. And I know that that's a confusing word because it can do both things, right? It does mean both things. But in this case, I mean, it provides the appearance of legitimacy. We've debated it. The best idea must have won. Now we're going to run with that idea. Therefore, whatever happens next is legitimate, say the people generally in power. So that's my vision overall for debate, for what that's worth. But your question is, well, what are the other options? And I think that's the right question. And I want to say, before we ever get into bits of individual discourse and what they could look like, that the number one answer is that this is not actually about individual conversations one to one. Politics is not, contrary to all these popular beliefs, at some level not about that. It's not about that. That's not what changes things politically for people. And it's also not what causes people to be oppressed or unhappy in the first place, right? If you look at what does change people's minds about politics in the long run, it's relationships, which are much bigger than any one conversation you could have with a person. We can get into that in a second. And it's also having lived experiences, like getting it put into a new kind of institution, whether that's the university system or a workplace. Having an abortion, having climate change happen to you, having these things I've just listed, we have empirical evidence that changes people's political views. Not always, by the way, in the way progressive and radical people might like to imagine, but they do change your mind. Politics is about the doing more than it is about the talking. And therefore, I would focus on that first. I really would. I wouldn't go and say, oh, how am I going to have another one-to-one conversation with someone in a different way? I would say, go do the other stuff. That's the work. But that said, there are some forms of discourse that appear to be more effective than debating. And I guess rather than dig super deeply into that, I'm going to just characterize a few aspects of them, because I think that's the most important thing, is to think about what do those types of discourse afford that debate doesn't afford. One of the things, and you can read all about this in my book if you want, one of the things is they allow for ambiguity. And I would say debate does almost exactly the opposite of that a lot of the time. I know out there someone on the internet is already writing response in the comments. No, I debate in a way that has lots of ambiguity, but actually when you're trying to win, you're almost forced to collapse. I mean, I notice this even when I'm talking, right? Like when I write a minute and a half clip for Instagram, oh my gosh, I mean, how can I possibly have ambiguity? It's really not part of the structure. And the same is true in many ways of debate, because you seem to be almost conceding to your enemy or your opponent, and you're not supposed to be conceding to them. And I know you can do the artful thing where you like first give them all the benefit of the doubt and steel man them and whatever, but realistically that's actually not what's going on most of the time in most of these debates.
Mm-hmm.
So ambiguity. You express ambiguity and you get the other person to express ambiguity, and you both think through your ambiguity. That seems to be quite effective. The other thing is the sharing of experiences. And in order for that to work, I would suggest you need to, and some of this data suggests also, you need to, in some way, have a relationship with the person you're talking to. Even if you've just met them, they need to feel to some degree like you have time for them, you are there, you are listening to them, you are not judging them. That seems to be somewhat important, and it's really hard to do if you're talking to someone you really don't agree with, right? And then you're sharing experiences of the issue at hand with them, and that appears to allow for a moment where thinking is shiftable in some way. And I also want to say that the conversations I'm describing happen between people who are relatively equal in power. um, I don't mean this in the sense of completely, because that's A, impossible, and B, often. For example, deep canvassing, which is a type of conversation I outline in my book, happens when someone in an oppressed or minority group, or at least affected by the issue, talks to someone who doesn't have such high stakes in the issue, and that's not a completely equal power structure. But I'm not describing, notably, the idea that a random member of the audience is going to talk to somebody who is funded by billionaires, right? That's not an equal power structure at all.
Hmm.
And I do think that because debates are so often just a legitimization structure for like these power structures, we can't begin there. We have to begin with people who have some invested interest in knowing each other further, in seeing each other as to move to a different area of sociology I use in my book, which is social contact hypothesis. They probably should have some kind of shared goal, some kind of shared stakes in the world together.
That's
Um,
right.
and so
Yeah.
fundamentally, that also means we can't really debate with people who are already profoundly, profoundly opposed to our own well-being, right? We can't debate a fascist, as they say. I'm not, or even have these kind of like thoughtful conversations with them if they're already opposed to our, oppression and extermination. But I do think there is this sort of very uncomfortable middle ground. Here's where I get yelled at by left-wing people, where people who are already experiencing hardship and oppression can sometimes change the minds of those around them about certain issues if they're willing to have difficult conversations. And that happens at the cost of their own well being. It does. There's no, I would never bullshit people about that. I think in many cases, even a practice like deep canvassing, which is trained and intentional, is probably really hard on the people doing it. And living in an infrastructure that enables conversations like that, even if it's informal, has psychological costs also. And none of that looks like debate.
No, and I think crucially what Kirk, to bring it back to like the topic of the moment and his sort of the apotheosis of this specific kind of far right online culture, it feels like, um, Kirk didn't just debate, right?
Mhm.
Spencer's point is that he was really bringing people together under these slogans like "Prove me wrong."
Yeah.
He would tour with these slogans, um, because he understood isolation. Actually, like
Mhm.
that was what was going on. Uh, but Spencer says it wasn't just that he understood isolation, and he means the isolation largely of white men, I
Yeah.
guess, the perception of or feeling of isolation,
Sometimes women.
um, right? The wages of whiteness disappearing. He says that he also understood that they wanted to be top dog. This is a phrase he uses.
Mm.
And certainly, like the invitation, "Prove me wrong," is not a right. It's not a welcoming to share stories. It's intentionally antagonistic, because that's perhaps a logic that is implicitly understood. But I think the thing you just mentioned was it reminded me that the book is also this incredibly nuanced study of false consciousness, as it's known, like the ways in which people behave in ways that seem to be counter to their interests or potential flourishing, even, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and I wanted to maybe pick up on that in relationship to this, forming of a cult of celebrity around Kirk, where people apparently 10 to 30 years old, 100% brand recognition of Kirk. Like everybody knew who this guy was. 40 and up, basically no one knew who he was. So really an
Yeah, at
incredibly
34, I'm on the borderline. I was like, I
yeah,
know, I think I know that name. I really didn't know. It's interesting with these very strong divides. But my partner knew.
I
My
know.
partner immediately was like, this will be bad. There will be bad consequences for this. So it's an interesting.
Yeah. And yeah, super interesting. I knew that you'd have thoughts on that, like the demographic kind of
Mhm.
aspect of this, which seems to be something you take very seriously. That kind of those generational divides are perhaps like failed opportunities to build some sort of like lasting, nar- you know, narrative, we'll call it, right? Which is what, in some ways, Kirk was selling, is the restoration of these Christian values.
Mhm.
But to bring it back to the sort of debate over what his death means. I mean, today is his memorial. There is a 60,000 seat stadium in Arizona that will be devoted to this memorial. Every senior official in the Trump administration will be there.
Wow.
So it's political theater. It's basically a kind of authoritarian martyr
Yeah.
that they're making him into. And it almost doesn't matter who his killer actually was,
Yeah.
and what the ideology was. The fallout was just like instantaneous, and there was this overt exploitation, I would say, of his death. Um, you know, I wonder about still the kind of function of debate in his rise, and what role that will play in this ritual that will be about celebrating his demise in some ways, like the glory of his life and so on. Uh, um, but in particular, how the vindictiveness and revanchist politics of the Trump administration sees this as really an opportunity to kind of mainstream its whole agenda of retribution, against these perceived others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely what's going to happen. And I will say, several months before Trump was elected, I contained within me the DNA of all American liberalism, and I was listening to This American Life, which does excellent reporting, whatever you may think of, the sort of center left mainline views it has implicitly. And they have an entire episode that's just about the people that Trump wants revenge on, what he says about how he wants to revenge himself on them, and what's going to happen to them. And I think it's worth listening to for anyone. Um, and it's terrifying.
Hmm.
And it should be. And some of the people they interview are Republicans who are going to leave the country and probably are in the process of leaving the country. So he's a very revenge based guy, Trump himself, but also I think it's the ideology of a lot of people in that bit of the political world. And that is in some ways what it is to be a reactionary, right? It's that you think someone has taken your country away, and so you don't just need to take it back in that ideology, but you also need to get revenge. And therefore, this is one of the costs of this kind of political violence. I mean, I, I it's very complicated to talk about political violence. I will say, as a starting point, though, I get asked about it a lot, and this was true before Kirk's death. Like, Americans would come up to me at my book talks, and I wrote a book that is mostly nothing to do with violence, and they would ask me about violence because Americans know better, perhaps, than other nations that it could happen anytime and almost to anyone because we have guns, right? And I guess the thing I always try to tell people, and it is a very complicated and almost equivocal thing by nature, is that, look, on the one hand, political violence has a very mixed track record in terms of either success or moral acceptability, however you want to measure that. It's I mean, what can you say? Of course it does. And very often, the exact people who would like to enact a, let's say, political violence from the left are the least well positioned people to do it. I remember once someone asking Ash Sarkar about this in a giant like UCL auditorium, and she responded, pointing out that a lot of the time, the people that have won through political violence are armies. So she said, like, do you, the UCL students, have an army of people that are willing to take over the state? I don't think so. And I agree with her. I mean, even putting aside whatever moral qualms you might have, most of the time, if you succeed with political violence in some meaningful, obvious way, it's because an entire army has said, actually no to this regime. So I'm not saying that there are no justifiable forms of political violence, because I think that's nonsense. In fact, I think almost no one on planet Earth thinks that. Almost anyone you could talk to on any part of the political spectrum, you ask them, oh, should we have fought the Nazis? Yes, of course. They believe in political violence. Can you shoot someone who's invading your home with a machine gun? Yes, they think that is acceptable, right? Very, very, very few people actually don't believe in political violence. And most of the time, if they're grandstanding about it, it's silly, right? I mean, it's like a pot shot at stupidity to claim so. Which is not to say that we should take it lightly, or we take it lightly, or think that this particular example was necessarily a good idea. It's very likely it will have had only perverse effects in the long run on the health of American society. But um, yeah, I don't like a lot of posturing about this because I think it's either stupid or ingenuine. Like, of course, some people believe in political anxiety, like political violence. Of course, they do. Most people do. Um, They just don't agree on when it's acceptable. And
Yeah, 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 yeah. And who has a right to wield it,
yeah,
right? Like,
right,
what is
and violence,
legitimate
violence, violence, and
political?
blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
Like, I guess I don't something that I think is, like, a fundamental sticky part of my own personality is I really don't like it when people are engaged in bullshit, you know? A disagreement, whatever, fine. When people are insincere, it drives me
yeah,
up the wall. And I think that
right.
I do find the insincerity of, like, the hand-wringing a bit ridiculous, like, everyone, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and similarly, I find this. I mean, we talked about this early when we were beginning, but I find the take by Ezra Klein of like he was doing
Mm,
discourse well, very either insincere. I don't know. I mean, I don't know Ezra, so
mhm,
I don't want to judge too far there. I don't know, but either insincere, genuinely an attempt to position oneself to remain within a certain power structure, and insincere in that sense, or like he didn't Google anything. I don't know which it is.
yeah,
I mean, I know that sounds mean or bitchy, and they're like already a million caveats to this essay, but I don't understand. Like,
nor do
this
I.
is a man, Kirk, who had a systematic process within his own organization for harassing and threatening people on campus who had different views than himself. He was not an earnest believer in free speech. He made people feel incredibly unsafe physically a lot of the time for having left
Mhm,
wing views. There's a whole list of professors he went after. You know, this is not, is this how we want discourse to work? I think not.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's conducive to violence. It's antithetical to the kind of discourse that people at least say they want, which is respectful, civil, for lack of, I mean, this is the term that gets used in surveys, discourse, that allows people, as you say, a container in which they're allowed to move their views around, right?
Mhm.
Rather than they're fixed in place and almost fighting for the survival of their views. But it's unfortunate that we have to put so much stock in what feels like really pretty crass opportunism on his part. But it's an interesting kind of moment to still try and reflect on, yeah, the value of discourse at a time where you admit in your book, um, it feels appropriate to be crestfallen at the demise of, this liberal humanist ideal of democracy that says, if we all just kind of get together and fight it out, then we can have a shared fate, right? Like we can actually kind of build those things. And, I wonder to what extent we can attribute, is the death basically of the myth of the liberal humanist public sphere being kind of realized in this moment, right? Where, you know, uh, there are many who wring their hands and say this kind of fascist celebration of violence and vindictiveness is just bad, and I don't want to look at it. Like I'm seeing a lot of that.
Yeah.
Um, and then others who, will effectively dehumanize the MAGA movement as misguided, right? It doesn't, that to me is the polarization on some level, is a liberal quietism versus this kind of, left sanctimony, I guess,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term. Like, do you see, like, there settler colonial societies like Israel, the United States, Canada are inherently violent. And in these societies, there's still been this sense that they are democracies and thus inherently good.
Mhm.
But we're seeing, it feels like, the emergence of like this multipolar world, multiple wars happening, and Kirk's death suddenly pulls attention in this way that is remarkable. You know, um, I don't know. I don't know if there's a
Have
question in
some
there.
thoughts if you want. Yeah, I can find a question or I can find several questions.
Yeah.
I mean, I think first of all, I when you look at the video, I mean, I'm not encouraging people to necessarily look at his actual moment of death, but when you look at the videos of where Kirk was shot, he had a huge crowd gathered around him. Huge.
Hmm.
Huge. And I often think that's almost the better question is like what are all those young, mostly men, but some women, almost all white people, what are they doing standing on that campus listening to him? You know, and some people were there to challenge his views and but a lot of them are there because this is a way of belonging and communion. And I
Hmm.
understand that might feel distasteful and bad, but I am neither a liberal quietist nor a moral grandstander on the left. I think in terms of strategy, I try anyway to be neither of those things, but to be strategic. What is strategically happening there? In this case, I would say this debate is a cover. It's posing as debate as like equal exchange where we come to the best solution. It's not that, it is a recruitment event essentially.
Right.
recruitment and motivation, which almost all protests, by the way, also are, right? They are moments for people that agree with each other already to
Hmm.
pull each other further into the movement, motivate each other, keep each other there. What a great way to keep a bunch of young, right wing, mostly men, going than to say, oh, I want to go see him talk. It was amazing. He totally shot down that guy. Great. So that's what's happening there, which
Hmm.
means, to be honest, that the correct anti fascist strategy may not have to do with any guns, but it's probably to disrupt the event and make it annoying to be at. Right? Um,
Hmm.
and
Because, as you say in your book, we have to take very seriously the glue that is being created at
yeah,
that event,
yeah. You
and
know,
what kinds of, yeah, values are being
yes.
like really embedded at
And
those
I
events.
know that people don't want to deal with this, but let me tell you this. I am a woman on the internet, and by chance, over the last 3 months, also through significant strategy on my part, I gained 20,000 followers.
Mm,
And as a result, I
mhm,
also gained like 1,000 new people that want to harass me. And these people are here and they're not going away.
mm,
Right? And I
mhm.
think that liberal fantasy is these people will just go away after the next election. Fuck that, you know?
I
And if
think
you
you're
feel
right.
safe right now, you will not feel safe forever because I am honestly like a fancy white rich lady. I know perfectly well that I am, and I accept that privilege, and I am getting harassed. So imagine how people down the street feel who are poorer, people of color. Imagine, right? These people are here and they're here to stay, and they seemingly all take photos of themselves at the gym all the time, but that's another story for another day.
Mhm,
Okay,
mhm,
so it's like a recruitment event for these folks who are not going away. And I think any non serious take on it, we can either see it as opportunistic and cynical, or if we're going to be nice to our sort of liberal semi comrades for a minute, either it's opportunistic, or, and I'm saying this partially because they're going to be people we need to collaborate with, it is clouded by ideology. The idea that liberalism doesn't come with harmful ideology that skews people's vision is wrong. It does. And one of the things it does here is it means that people can't see the power structures in place and they don't see where the recruitment is happening, where the motivation is happening, where the, and so they can say, oh, it's a debate. This must be good. This is what we want to be doing. I mean, honestly, a lot of the time, the nicest thing we can say about people that we feel are letting down the movement is they're misguided rather than cynical actors. If they're misguided, well, look,
mhm.
guys, like read up on this. This is an ideological move and it is not there for the reasons it claims to be. And you can see, by the way, among a million other reasons, when you look at the absolutely explicitly racist statements, not so much by Kirk, who always is pretty good at like doing this weird double talk, not always, but often, but by people in his organization. Many of them just like full masks off, like wish we could have killed all the black people kind of people, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But there's an ideology at stake when people bring up debate, especially people on the far right, but also people who are liberals in a very different way. And we need to think about, is that ideology a real representation of what is actually happening? Or is it positioning certain power structures as legitimate, whether they are or not? And
Mhm,
the answer is the latter. And there are lots of reasons, and you can read my whole book. So it's a spectacle that gathers a crowd. Also, obviously, we don't actually mostly live in this physical, like public sphere that he was in for 1 second, right? We mostly
mhm.
live online. So what is he going to do with that event? This is what he does with it. He takes clips of himself that make him look like he's winning and he puts them online and he gets all of his fans also. He has a very dedicated content strategy
Oh
and
yeah,
they put them out and
yeah.
they get people in. And I know because I do content strategy too and I know exactly how it works. I just try to do less manipulative and shitty things with it. But it's always a content strategy because that's the nature of the platforms. So my point is that's what he's doing. That's what he's doing. He's not doing the beautiful ideological thing that Ezra Klein thinks he's doing. He's doing a much more complicated thing that includes harassment of his enemies, includes all kinds of other cynical
It's the
stuff.
Steve Bannon playbook. He was
Yeah.
following Trump's footsteps, right?
Yes. And
Yeah,
so then your last question, I think, was roughly, is this vision of the public sphere dead? Is this was it, or was
basically.
it always a myth? And I think the answer
Yeah.
is it was mostly always a myth. And I want to
Mhm,
be specific here. I mean this in the political sense. The idea that you and I could go have a really cool marketplace of ideas about like I don't know. What should we do with the play Hamlet? Like, yes, people are actually pretty good at changing their mind about what they should do with the play Hamlet, unless they've developed like super entrenched views. I'm not saying there
mhm.
isn't anything to liberal humanist discourse about like the nature of human
Sure.
existence. I love
Mhm,
that stuff. I am a nerd. Let's be real. I'm asking, is that the way political change happens? And could it happen that way realistically, given what we know about human societies and human psychology? And the answer is no. We do not really function in that way. The kind of sphere that is posited in this particular vision of like the liberal myth of the marketplace of ideas and debate is
mhm,
mostly there, either again as opportunism or as genuine misrecognition. And if we want to engage in political acts genuinely that we think will actually change society, we have to do something else. We don't necessarily need to do something that involves violence, and most of the time I think that's a mistake. But we do need to do things that are not just debating each other. And anything else
mhm.
probably plays into the hands of the far right.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It feels that way. One of the articles I was reading quoted a tweet, an X post by Kirk, where he says, "When you pierce the liberal echo chamber, minds are changed, millions of them." And this is the key part. He says, "The campus left is threatened by debate, dialogue, discussion, and differing ideas."
Hmm.
It's just he's just layering on words that are meant to kind of invoke these valorized ideas: debate, dialogue, discussion. They're, pleonastic words layered on one another. But what he's trying to claim ownership of is this, this thing that it feels like is on life support if it ever lived, right? This possibility of forming a movement through debate. Yeah, I think,
Yeah, but look at what he
yeah,
does and not at what he
I
says. Which
know.
we should do for everyone, including like me.
That's right. Yeah.
What is he actually doing? Is he primarily just doing debating? No, he is taking enormous amounts of money. He is profoundly entrenched within the elites of the Republican Party. I mean, he's doing all kinds of things, and he's like harassing his enemies on campus and trying to intimidate them into shutting up. So he does
Mhm.
not actually believe that, and we know that
Right.
he doesn't believe that because he is not doing that.
He's selling political loyalty. He was selling political loyalty from the beginning, and he created a media empire around that as well, spitting out these sorts of influencers that it feels as though are largely designed to scramble our brains, give us these sorts of adrenaline rush moments, these dopamine hits, these shareable, you know, moments of catharsis, I suppose, but. Yeah, this idea that the campus left. There was such a thing as well as the campus left.
I mean, there is sort of a thing as a campus left, right? The question is like,
Right.
there's always a variety of them.
Sure.
I wanted to say one more thing because I think you asked me such a smart question earlier when we were like pre-chatting about this, and I want to
Mm,
just tap into it. Um, uh, you said, are people turning to violence because they don't have access to debate? And I don't think you necessarily meant
mm,
this in total earnestness. Like this isn't your personal theory of how that works, but I
mm,
I I wanted to just say I think there is an intuition about that floating around in the world, and
mhm,
I would encourage people not to make that assumption, even implicitly in their own thinking, but instead to think, what do people who make the demand for debate really want? And I think there are two answers. In one case, they mean, I want to embarrass and show up my enemies in a giant display of political theater. In my other writings, I've talked about debate as like gladiatorial combat for the modern age, right? So it's basically like violence that you get to watch in real time and cheer. Either they want that, or they actually are kind of looking for a form of agency. We might not like them, we might think they are horrible and racist, and maybe they are, but that is a genuine attempt at a form of agency on both right and left and everywhere in between. And I think people are lacking forms of agency right now. They don't know what to do to get agency. And one of the worst things we could do on the sort of like, let's say, broad left, that I imagine listens to your podcast, is I don't know, maybe it's not, maybe it's a narrow left, but anyway, is one of the main things we can do is find forms of agency that are neither debate nor, in most cases, going to have anything to do with guns, and help people find those forms of agency too. That they will feel less interested in debate, frankly, when they are organizing in their community, when they are disrupting fascist recruiting events in other ways, and when they're doing many other things that generate a form of agency. And rather than say, oh, well, we don't debate, so now we have to turn to violence, we should look at all of the forms of agency that are in between those two
mhm.
things, right? Those two kind of like extreme and often quite useless, depending on the situation, modes. There's everything
Yeah.
else in between. It's not one or the other. I really get comments from people these days, angry comments, as you say. I get a lot of harassment saying, well, if it's not debate, then it's just violence and you're just endorsing violence. But there's so much in between. You could do
Yeah.
almost anything else on planet Earth except for these two things.
There's a lot of stuff,
Like,
you know,
what?
that you
That's
can
how
put
Wayne
your
Weston thought
energy
about this ideology.
into.
Yeah.
For sure. There's a whole spectrum of different kinds of satisfying agency, for sure, that do provide a feeling of resolution. Here in Halifax, we do placemaking events, which are often, these attempts to bring out community that don't see one another and build that connective tissue just around, shared love of food and place and those things.
Yeah,
So,
build the
of
social
course,
infrastructure, organize people to get the
there it
materials that
is.
they need as consumers and in their workplace, disrupt the fascists from bringing people on campus and recruiting them into their horrible movements. And
Yeah.
by the way, the other thing that people have said a lot since Kirk was shot that I think is bad political analysis is they say, well, he's not necessarily a fascist. And you can debate exactly how far right he is, so I'm not saying there's no room for debate, lol, there. But you know, fascism means something. It has a definition.
It
As a
does.
political theory PhD, let's just get into it for 1 second. Fascists
Yeah.
are a very specific thing. They are not Stalinists. They are not, I don't know, like Islamo-terrorists. We might dislike these groups, but they're a different bad thing. And that specific bad thing is far right, nationalist, persecutes minorities, and wants to bring a country back into its original form of purity by removing degenerate people, right? It's a very specific thing that happens over and over again in modernity. And I would say Kirk fits pretty well within that, and certainly the administration he's supporting does. And so it's not some crazy exaggeration to talk about fascism here. It's a very considered opinion. And you can disagree, but you should really think through that definition if you're going to do it.
Yeah. I think it's worth dwelling with, and it is a hostility toward complexity, toward a complex society that seems to be in many ways at the heart of fascism.
That's
That
right. And I
combined
think,
with retribution.
obviously the other group that's awakening, and I mean this lovingly, is like the stupid left. Like, just because someone agrees with you politically doesn't mean they've thought everything through. But there is a difference between the stupid left and the stupid right, in my experience, which is that, at least to some degree, the stupid left is less interested in like removing minorities via death and violence, right? Like, these things are bad, but they are not equivalent. And I want complexity of thinking, but I also care a lot about the structures of power that we are trying to investigate here.
I appreciate you making the time to talk to me. You're incredibly outspoken, and it's difficult to be outspoken in this moment. Certainly, like Rachel Gilmore, a Thai journalist, was harassed for pointing out that this was likely to lead to more far-right violence. So, I mean, just like taking the risk, as it were, to actually say these things takes a degree of bravery, to be honest, in this moment. So thanks for doing it.
So appreciate it. Thank you so much, Scott.